Numbers 21, 4-9. From Mount Or, they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. But the people became impatient on the way. The people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we detest the miserable food. Then the Lord sent poisonous serpents among the people, and they bit the people, so that many Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned by speaking against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord to take away the serpents from us." So Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, "Make a poisonous serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten shall look at it and live." So Moses made a serpent of bronze and put it upon a pole. And whenever a serpent bit someone, that person would look at the serpent of bronze and live. This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Have you ever speed tiptoed backwards into a baritone saxophone player and jammed a flute into your upper lip? It hurts. That happened during my first year of marching band, and it is not my favorite memory. It happened because I hadn't figured out yet how to keep myself moving in a line parallel to the edge of the field. I thought I was going like this, and I was kind of going like this. I think I was staring back at where I'd been, which didn't give me any useful information whatsoever. I should have been watching the conductor, which would have ensured the edge of the field was also in my peripheral vision, and I actually would have been able to see my bari sax friend rapidly approaching me. And I probably would have been able to see the conductor's facial expression as she realized we were going to run into each other. Now, that was a pretty tricky move. That whole show was kind of intense, and both of us were marching backwards towards each other. But it still could have gone better if 8th grade me had been watching the conductor instead of staring at the ground. And like I said, that show was kind of intense. That's not even the worst story from that year. Somebody else twisted her ankle during a show. I don't actually know all of the details of how that one happened. But another 8th grader, a trombone player, was watching the ground during a set where he was basically supposed to be leaping backwards across the football field. We had to move really fast. Now, if he had been watching the conductor, he would have known the tempo and kept his feet moving as fast as everybody else. And if he had been looking anywhere other than at the ground, he would have been able to sidestep the person who backed into him. And then that person would not have knocked his trombone to the ground, where it got flattened by a whole row of musicians marching backwards over it. Now, thankfully, the trombone player had the presence of mind to roll out of the way, and so only his instrument got trampled. The band director took that flattened trombone and put it up in the band room to remind us to keep our eyes up. But it's hard to remember that rule when you're trying to figure out how to get your feet on the right spot on the ground, and your depth perception is awful. When we start learning to march, we learn by looking for our dot on the field, which means that at first we do need to look at the ground, because that's the only way we're going to figure out where we're going. But as long as we're looking down, we can't see how the other people around us are moving and how we might need to adjust our path to our dot to avoid hitting them. We can't confirm how fast our feet should be moving, because even if we can hear the music and have a good sense of rhythm, light travels faster than sound. And a football field is a big enough space that the people at the front of the field and the people at the back of the field will be playing at different times if we just listen to each other. You got to watch the conductor. Also, if you're looking at the ground, your posture is terrible and you're not going to make good music. So that's my marching band background. Now let's consider another situation where looking at the ground seems like a good idea, but is actually super dangerous. Our scripture today: the Israelite camp has been thrown into chaos with all these snakes underfoot. Now, logically, the smartest thing to do would be to watch the ground for snakes so you can avoid getting bitten, since we know their bite is deadly. But there are just too many snakes, and people keep getting bitten, and they can't avoid these things. So people are looking down to try and keep control of their situation, but things keep getting worse no matter how hard they try to take care of themselves. Now, jumping back to marching band for a minute, I remember sometimes the director liked to mess with us to make sure we were watching. The conductor would suddenly change tempo, and we were all supposed to follow their lead. But usually only about half the band was watching, and so it just became this big mess of sounds with people marching at different speeds and eventually walking into each other. Now, the director was kind. We did that sort of exercise when we did not have our instruments in our hands, and we're not likely to back into each other at top speed and jam instruments into our mouths. But I mentioned that silly game of paying attention because if we pay attention, there are actually 2 words for snake in this passage. Well, okay, if we pay attention and have access to the original text, then we notice that. You're not going to see it in the translation. God sends what is translated as fire snakes. But whenever this word comes up and it's not in reference to this particular story, it is translated either as flying serpents or seraphim. So that sounds like these things might be dragons or the kind of angels that have lots of eyes and wings. But the people, including Moses, don't use this word. They only ever mention plain old snakes. When God tells Moses to make the bronze serpent, again, it's that word that sounds more like it's talking about dragons or seraphim than the average garden snake. But when Moses complies, he just puts a plain old snake on a pole. Now, maybe this isn't a big deal, and these 2 words really just mean the same thing, and the connection of one with God and the other with humans is pure coincidence. That is possible. But maybe God sent seraphim, angels, to terrorize this camp, and nobody realized it because they were so caught up in staring at the ground and trying not to get bitten. When we focus on doing things our way, the way where we get as much control as possible over our situation, we can miss what God is doing. And we can miss where, with some outside guidance, we could do so much better. Now, it's hard to have somebody else in charge. The Israelites were already struggling with this concept long before the snakes showed up. That's kind of the basic summary of the entire book of Numbers, is Israel complaining about Moses and God's authority. So they kept complaining to Moses and God about their leadership. They wanted the stability and security and food variety they'd had in Egypt. They wanted all the perks of their old life, just maybe ideally without Egyptian oppression. There are times when they make it clear they would totally accept being oppressed all over again to get those perks. Now, I don't want you to hear me wrong. Complaining to God is a good and healthy thing. Psalmists do it all the time. We have a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations, which is a big fancy word for let's complain to God. And that's not even where Jeremiah does most of his complaining to God. Complaining to God is one thing. But complaining that we could do a better job than God and God's chosen leader Moses is a very different thing. The Israelites in this story are not appealing to God to fix a problem that's within God's jurisdiction until God sends the snakes. They want to take away God's authority in their community. They would rather run things themselves, get access to some better food, and get out of the wilderness. And the wilderness doesn't stretch on forever. If they stopped following God's directions, they probably could have found a place with some decent food and agricultural potential a lot sooner than they did. It wouldn't have been the promised land, and they would have been just as vulnerable to attackers as every other nation that they later conquer under Joshua's leadership. But being in charge can feel good. And in the short term, we can make decisions that are more immediately satisfying for us than God's plans might be. So what does it take to look up at that bronze serpent? You have to look away from the ground, so you are vulnerable to more snake bites. You can't wait for other people to try it first and then follow their lead, because you might be dead from the venom before you can see how things go for the ones who looked up first. You have to let go of any control that you might have over the situation. Fights could happen. You can't know what's going on with everybody else in the moment because you have to keep your eyes on that bronze serpent up in the air. And so you have to trust that the instructions that Moses relays to you from God are reliable. And those instructions are reliable, and we know that because we're here reading the story and not stuck living it. But can we live that kind of faith? Can we look up and see what God is doing, even when lots of other urgent concerns are competing for our attention? Can we trust that God is taking care of us well enough that we don't have to cling to control over everything in our lives? The Israelites asked for better food and water, and then they asked for God to take away the snakes. God took care of them, but there were still snakes, and they still only had manna to eat. Are we willing to follow God's plan when it doesn't include the stuff we would like included? It's worth it. Think of the promised land that they will eventually reach. Think of the ways that God continues to protect these people throughout their wilderness journey and beyond. And in your own life, think of the times when you've taken a leap or a little hop of faith and the ways that God cares for us when we do those things. Look up. Fix your eyes on God. We don't have a bronze serpent as our visual aid. That would be pretty weird, honestly. But we have each other's eyes. We have the sunsets and the sunrises and all the scenery we so easily miss when we're driving down the road. Please continue to keep eyes on the road. You know, it's okay to miss some scenery sometimes. But we have the chance to trust that God can run the world better than we can. And so we can be part of God's team instead of trying to run our own separate operation. That means we can take a break and the world will not come to an end because of it. It means we can not totally deliver on things that we're trying to do, and God can still handle stuff. Means that we might not know all of what's happening with stuff that's very important to us in our lives, but we can trust that God is there and God is looking out for us. So, I challenge you this week to stop staring at the ground to watch for every little snake that might give us trouble. Look up and see what God is doing.